welcome to the latest edition of my series looking at American history. So we've got up to the start of the war. Now, as the war starts, we're going to start looking at the situation on both sides, looking at both the Union and the Confederacy to get an idea of how this war is likely to go and how it's likely to be fought before getting into the details of the battles. There's going to be two videos on this. This is the first one. Today we're looking at the military and political context. We'll move on and looking at the financial, the economic, and the kind of basic geography of it all as well before heading into the battles themselves. So let's crack on and have a look at this context. Right, first, the context of the Union in terms of overarching political position. So it's a well-established country. So this is the United States of America. It's just lost a bit. So it's got the kind of ideas of federal bureaucracy. It's got the fundamentals of government in place. There is a Congress. There is a Supreme Court. There is a White House where the president lives. So all the basis of a state and its functioning is there already. So also playing when we look at foreign relations, because obviously the USA has diplomats across the world, it has embassies in other countries. So they are better placed in that way. In Congress, we have complete Republican dominance because all the Southern, or almost all the Southern members have left. We will see there is one guy who hangs on all the way through, a guy called Andrew Johnson. He'll be really, really important later in our series because he becomes president. Probably the worst one ever, arguably. Might be a bit of an argument with that going on with the current incumbent, but definitely a really important character later on. But essentially, apart from him, the senators and the congressmen from the other states that have seceded, they all go. The Republicans dominate, but there is some Northern Democrat stuff there, so we have a functioning opposition. But Lincoln has in his hands the kind of party systems to try and get things done and get things through Congress. Most states in the Union were under Republican control, and again, this gives that kind of party discipline and party lines to help do that. And it means that they're pretty much going to back Lincoln. The few states that end up in Democrat hands don't really cause huge issues for Lincoln. There is also kind of extra governmental stuff going on. There's these voluntary organizations. Probably the most important and most famous one is the United States Sanitary Commission. What that does is it goes around helping the army, essentially making sure that the food and the conditions for the soldiers are as good as they possibly could. Volunteers going around making sure the soldiers have got clean bandages, that they're well cared for. So we've got here a real kind of effort going on across the Union. Now, there was opposition. There's a group that emerges known as referred to as the Copperheads, after the Copperhead snake, who are Democrats who were seen as being pro-Confederate. Not all Democrats were seen as pro-Confederate, but this group, referred to as Copperheads, were. A bit later on, we will see issues emerging with opposition. Probably the most famous example, it's not right at the beginning of the war, it's a couple of years later, which is the New York draft riots, which led to 120 deaths and took about 20,000 soldiers to actually subdue those riots. So generally speaking, politically, the Union is in quite a good place at the beginning of the war because it doesn't have a huge amount of things to alter. We've got the dominance of one party, but we have got a two-party system, and the party system continues to operate. And we see a general, at the beginning at least, a consensus behind the war effort. Right, the leader is Lincoln, President Lincoln. So his election, as we saw in previous videos, leads to a huge amount of controversy and is one of the sparks of the war. Now, Lincoln has not a huge amount of experience. So he has been a member of Congress, but he's not got government experience. He's not got any military experience. And so there were people at the time questioning, is this the right guy to be in charge? Now, he does create a cabinet, but pretty much holds together throughout the whole war. It's got some really capable people in it, some really notable figures in there. William Seward is a big one now. He did most of the dealings in terms of foreign policy. Chase is another really important figure who does a lot of running of the economic matters and running the economy, and the northern economy does really, really well during the Civil War in terms of coping with the demands of war, and then also the position it comes out of the war in. Now, Lincoln is doing a good job in terms of choosing the people to have around him, and he handles his cabinet really, really well, where he's got people who know better what to do on things. He defers to them. He's a brilliant, brilliant communicator, and that all works really smoothly. Less good early doors with the selection of generals, and we can question some of his choices here. There's a general called McClellan who proves to be completely ineffective, and Lincoln appoints him, gets rid of him, and reappoints him. So we see some issues early doors. It's a while before we end up with the generals who win the war, the Grant and Sherman. They come in a bit later. McClellan is a bit of a special interest of mine. He's not seen as a good general. He's seen as far, far, far too reluctant to fight. He sees the opposition as being far bigger and far greater and far stronger than it really is. But I always say, if I had to fight for a general, I'd have fought for him, because he didn't have he had a tendency that if he thought his men were going to get killed, to not go and fight at all. So in terms of military history, not a great general. In my personal preference, one I quite like. Lincoln shapes the overall strategy. He's highly, highly effective as he keeps the population of the Union with him. We've also seen that he does a good job in persuading a lot of the northern South to stay as part of the Union. There have been criticisms of his leadership, and this mainly goes down the civil liberties route, because there's a suspension of freedom of speech and press, and there's conscription, which really goes against quite a lot of American ideals. And there's also these 40,000 arrests for no particularly strong reason, well, without a really, really hard evidence. So Lincoln is seen as taking quite a hard line. Having said that, that is probably the sign of what is needed, given the scale of the Civil War. Right, on the other side, we've got the Confederacy. Now, it's new. It's just split off from the Union, as we can see in the map above me. So it's got to create all its new systems. There are state governments, but anything above that, it has to create. Now, the Confederacy is born out, in part, of this idea of states' rights. It's one of their arguments and one of the reasons why they secede. So this is going to make the job of the Confederate government really hard. Their kind of central federal government is going to be really difficult, because they've been stating all along that states should have a greater degree of independence. And that comes back a bit during the war, because we see governors such as Brown of Georgia and Vance of North Carolina, who often would ignore or oppose moves made by the Confederate government. And often this would involve things like holding back men in Georgia, for example, by Brown, who could have been or should have been going off and fighting in the Confederate Army in other states defending the Confederacy. But Brown kind of went, no, we need them here, you're not having them. So in terms of a really strong central government, which is what you need really, arguably, in the middle of a war, the Confederacy is not going to have it, because it's built on principles that won't allow that to happen. The other thing that makes politics really, really odd in the Confederacy is there is no party system at all. So they were all Democrats, really. The Whig Party had collapsed. The Know-Nothings had collapsed. Obviously, there's no Republicans. So there's Democrats, and then there's people who really weren't Democrats, but have probably voted Democrat most recently. And so what this then feeds into is there's a lot of argument and delay, and there's no really easy way of Davis and others controlling what's going on, because there are no party systems, no party lines. Now, again, there's an argument that the voluntary associations in the South did actually more in terms of the war effort than actual official government. And what we see here is we see often, particularly the planter class, taking a lead in their particular area, supplying the money to equip regiments, producing uniforms for their regiments. And we see a lot of reliance, therefore, on big local figures and local groups to sort out what's going on. And this can lead to the war effort being a bit patchy across the Confederacy. Right, so their leader is Davis. Right, on paper, he should have been the better leader, because he has military credentials. He was at West Point, which is the key training college for officers in the American Army. He spent 6 years as a lieutenant in the US Army. He saw service in the Mexican War, so he knows about the military. He has been in the military. He has fought. He has also got a far more political experience than Lincoln. He, in fact, had been US Secretary of War under Pierce, 53 through to 57. So you would think this guy is ideally positioned, and this is why he's unanimously chosen. He shows some insight at the beginning, unlike what's going on in the Union and amongst most of the people in the Confederacy. You go, oh, this will be over fairly quickly. Davis shows some insight that this is going to be a long and difficult struggle. However, he does prove to be a really, really poor leader in a lot of respects. He's not a great communicator, and he essentially doesn't play well with others. He doesn't work effectively with other politicians. And there's some real strong evidence of this all going completely wrong. So, for example, his cabinet is like a merry-go-round. He has 4 different secretaries of state and 6 different secretaries of war during the Civil War. So bear in mind, it lasts for 4 years. So his Secretary of War is changing more than once a year in the middle of a war. He tends to take too much on himself. He's really poor at delegation. But then he's also indecisive. A whole heap of stuff you don't want in a war leader. So on paper, Davis looked like he was the right choice. Looked like he would make a good war leader. In reality, he's going to turn out to be a complete disaster. And in a way, we can almost see absolute opposites with Lincoln and Davis. Well, Lincoln in 61, you looked at and gone, is this the right guy? And Davis, you'd have probably gone, oh yeah, this is the right guy. But then, as things develop, you go, well, Lincoln, he is an amazing war leader, an amazing war president, whilst Davis proves to be a bit of a disaster. Right. So some of the military aspects. So again, if we stay with the Confederacy, and then we'll go back to the Union. Right. So the Confederacy's got an issue in terms of size. So it's got about 9 million people in terms of population. It's fighting against an enemy that's got 22 million. And the population figures are even more difficult or complicated in terms of the Confederacy. About 3.5 million of the population are slaves, therefore unlikely to go out and fight for the Confederacy. They are not a huge number of people in a gigantic piece of land. So we're talking about 2 million square kilometres in the Confederacy. This is gigantic in terms of the scale. That's going to cause problems in terms of defending it. How do you get 9 million people to defend 2 million square kilometres? But in other ways, it might work to their advantage, because that's a lot of land to have to conquer and to take control over for the Union. Although 4 slave states remained in the Union, thousands of men from those states came down to fight for the Confederacy, bolstering the Confederate Army. Another issue that is argued to have been in favour of the Confederacy is that essentially production won't stop, despite the fact that the white male population is going to go off to fight, because the work is being done by the slave population. So in that way, the argument was that their economy will be able to keep going whilst they still fought the war. Now, the Confederates had some really strong views about why they were going to be better. The fact that Confederate men grew up in the countryside and their pursuits were things like riding and shooting. There was this common saying that one Confederate man was worth 10 Yankees, which was a term that they used for the northern population. And they said, well, look, the Yankees, they spend their lives working in factories. We spend our days outside on horseback shooting things. Who's going to make better soldiers? And that was a kind of a logic they had. They even had naval officers, about 300 of them, but they didn't really have any ships. So that was going to be a problem. Though one of my favourite stories of the Civil War is they did develop a submarine, which was some quite incredible military technology in that. It wasn't a great success, so it did sink a Union ship, but it then also sank itself, and the people manning it drowned. But again, a small aside on that. There were some key military leaders who joined the Confederacy, though most stayed in the Union. One of the most famous ones that's pictured above me is Robert E. Lee, proves to be a really significant general that we'll talk about a lot when we're doing the battles. Also worth bearing in mind, the South had provided the bulk of the troops in the Mexican War. They had a really kind of proud military tradition. Now, West Point is in the north, but most of the other military colleges were in the south. So a lot of the top brass might have been Union, but a lot of your trained soldiers were from the south. And then the other big advantage the Confederacy is going to have in terms of the military things going forward is that their job is simply to defend, and they've got this huge motivation because they're defending their homeland. So this is going to make a big difference. And yeah, they're fighting on land, they know. So the military with the Union then, well, first of all, it's huge, 22 million people. The 4 slave states that joined meant an extra 2 million for the population. It also would have given 80% increase in industry in the Confederacy, which the Confederacy doesn't get. They had a huge advantage with their navy, a lot more men, a lot more ships. The top military leadership was trained at West Point, which was in the north, and 2/3 of military leaders remained loyal to the Union, and so did most of the regular army. So your actual standing army as it was stayed loyal to the Union in the most part. In terms of military supplies, there's just no comparison really, and I've got a chart on there that kind of illustrates this. So they're producing 15 times more iron. They got 25 times more ships in terms of tonnage. They produce 32 times more firearms. That's going to make a huge difference, obviously, during the war. 14 times more textile production. So when it comes to things like uniforms, despite all the cotton the South has got, the actual production of textiles is taking place in the North. And the overall industrial capacity is 10 times bigger. So if this comes a long war of attrition, where it's who has the most men and who has the most stuff, then the Union is going to have a massive advantage. But its objective is much harder. It has got to try and conquer the South, suppress it, keep control of it, and then bring it back into the Union. So you've got more men, you've got more stuff, but you've got a really hard job. Right, there are several debates that come out of this. One of the ones in terms of politics is the states' rights bits and how much that hampers the Confederacy that we've looked at already. There's one I'm not going to give a huge amount of time to, which is this idea that the Confederacy died of democracy. It was just too democratic for its own good. It's rubbish. That I really do think it's a rubbish argument. I mean, there were arrests of draft evaders, vigilante groups within full knowledge of the government went around destroying any opposition press. Any kind of discussion of slavery and stuff is all suppressed. It doesn't look like it's doing hugely democratic things different to the Union. I don't think that's any real reason why it lost. A more interesting one is the rich man's war, poor man's fight. So as conscription came in, if you are an ordinary poor southern white man, then you cannot avoid the draft. But it did seem possible if you were a rich plantation owner that you could. So you could hire a substitute to avoid fighting. You get an exemption if you had a managerial role on a plantation. But so this looks attractive, particularly as the argument starts off. Well, actually, the planter class caused the war, and then the planter class avoid fighting. The numbers and the details don't really seem to support this. There seems to be very few of that planter class who really completely shirked any military duty. Now, there might have been, obviously, there would have been officers and things like that, but the majority of them did go and fight. It is a perception that has stayed, that has remained as a kind of impression of the Civil War. It might be that the division is more to do with geography than it is to do with class. Upland areas where there weren't the planter domination and there was limited support for secession, we might have seen here there's less support for fighting and people avoiding going and fighting. So it could be more regional based and based on feelings towards secession and slavery overall, rather than necessarily just the rich and the poor. Right, thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, share and subscribe, and I'll put some polls and things on here as well. Right, see you next time.